Welcome to another Trench Chats. I'm really pleased this week to welcome Samantha Cowan from Canada. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine, fine. Thanks for coming. Now, I know you've got a healthy interest and indeed knowledge of the military history of both world wars, but you're not a historian as such. You're a tourism professional. You work in battlefield tours.
That's right. Yeah, I'm an operator. So I'm more dealing with hotel contracts and guides and working with so many different local communities around the world that have some sort of connection to the Canadian battlefield story.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things, we tend to think the Great War was just 1914, 18, but we've had a century since the Great War and a century of people visiting battlefields. And battlefield tourism, which both you and I work in, is a really interesting and important subject.
Very much so. Absolutely.
And for you, I mean, you studied tourism at university.
Yep. Yep. And I went into it not thinking that I would kind of follow in my dad's footsteps or follow, work in battlefields per se. I think it's just one of those things you just get so addicted to, the once you learn something, you kind of just from there, it just explodes into a real passionate interest. But I didn't go into the program thinking that I would be studying battlefields or battlefield tourism. I just kind of looked at as tourism as a whole. But within that program, at the university, we really did delve into the subject of remembrance tourism and battlefield tourism. So it kind of naturally progressed from there for sure.
Because I'm sure some people listening to this will probably think it's a bit of an odd thing to think that there is something called battlefield tourism and that
Mm.
remembrance tourism exists, but we've got to classify it somehow, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it is becoming more of a subject to talk about.
And you work for the company that I think your dad started, is that right?
Yep. hmm we've been working. I've been working with him for since 2013, but he's been working on these tours since 1980s, so long time. I think he started with Insight. I might be wrong about that, but he kind of was contracted out and then started a company here in Canada in 1986.
And in that time, and have you both seen the interest in Canada and battlefield tourism coming from Canada grow?
Oh, absolutely. And I think even when I started, there's so many other programs that we do at the company because the company is a wholesaler. We organize so many different types of programs, not just battlefields, but battlefields was something that would come up every single year. And even when I started, people were asking, well, when is that kind of going to die out? Like, when are people going to stop looking at battlefields? But since I've started, we've seen this huge boom. I don't think it's something that's going to go away. I think it's so important to our human history, and more people are learning and people are asking more questions. So yeah, huge increases since I started working in this job. Huge increases. I think before it used to be only like a 15% of our business was battlefield or remembrance tourism, and now it's more than half. I would say probably 75% of the programs that we run are specifically battlefield related.
And the Canadians that come across with you, are they driven to come by a personal connection to it through family, or is it a general desire to know about Canadian history, or a bit of both, maybe?
Yeah, for sure, a bit of both. I think what surprises me the most is how many people come over because they had just a general interest, and then say halfway through a program that they realize now that they have a relative that has a direct connection to this. I think it's something that I mean, nowadays it's a little better. I think a lot of more people are coming out and saying, we have a relative, but we don't know where they fought or what regiment they were in, or what have you. But I see it all the time on so many tours where we kind of have to prepare travel agents ahead of time, to let them know there are certain ways that you can find out if you do have a family relation. And it's so great to find that out before the tour goes. But I mean, inevitably, it happens all the time. And I'm sure you've had this as well, where someone is on tour and they realize or they decide to speak up about some sort of relation that they have. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
for
mean,
sure.
sometimes you get somebody that is just wandering around a cemetery and they've got an unusual name, and they suddenly see that name, on a headstone, and they've got no idea that they had a connection to this.
For sure, absolutely. And you know what? I mean, I'm in that group too. I mean, I remember when my dad took me up to the Menin Gate and took me around the side, and he showed me all these Cowans on the memorial, and I was like, "Wow, are any of them related to us?" And he was like, "I don't know." So it is interesting that people kind of have that realization. I mean, there's so many different reasons why people would want to go on these battlefield tours, and we operate so many programs like, that are directly for the military or directly for tank engineers. So there are these specific niches as to why people go on these tours, but the family relation that's interesting, because sometimes it just kind of pops up like that.
And I guess that makes the trips quite personal for these people, and personal for the whole group, because they're all connected by this story, and their
Oh,
relatives were connected
so
by it.
yeah, for sure. And I think that's important to try to figure out ahead of time, or when you're on tour with these people, have the guide write down these stories, that so that you can continue learning before and after the tour as well. I think that strengthens not just the bonds between family members, but as you said, like people on tour, because then all of a sudden someone else on tour can say, "Oh wow, not only did this battle really happen, but this woman that I'm sitting behind, her great uncle was in that." I think it's just a great way of bringing us all together, that fundamental understanding we need.
And those individual stories help bring the bigger picture alive, I think, as well, don't they?
Exactly. And it's the same for me. I think, I studied the First World War because I found that very interesting, and I always worked with Second World War veterans. So for me, I needed that understanding of the First World War. And then so you read these stories of the First World War, and you learn about it. And then to meet someone, like I got to meet a granddaughter of the great granddaughter of a man in the Monchy 10. So the Monchy Le Preux, the 10 Newfoundlanders of the Royal Regiment. And I remember meeting her and just being like, I kind of fangirled over this girl, just because for me, that gave me a real link to these guys. For me, it made it true, you know?
Yeah, it's not just a list of names in a regimental history, is it? It's someone real, someone standing in front of you.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And it kind of is scary, isn't it? Because it's like 100 years ago was 100 years ago. But then you have this real walking, talking, breathing human in front of you that has this, and all of a sudden these events don't seem that far away. It all seems very much connected.
Yeah, I think that's one of the amazing things about studying the past and doing what we do, is you realize how much 100 years is just a blink of an eye.
Mm. No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's scary to think it's only, a few generations between us and those events.
And I know you were over quite a lot during the First World War, Centennial. You'd have seen, as we did, this huge growth of interest during that period, making the battlefields quite crowded.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very crowded.
And I was going to say that brought with it quite a few problems with big events, didn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, I think I've talked about events a lot and ceremonies a lot, and just kind of the sensitivities around it, and the geo blocking technology that the CWGC had to come out with, to make sure that these areas don't get degraded. There's no degradation or anything like that. But it's centenary it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because there's so many interesting things about the centenary, and so much good that came out of those events. But it still was quite tricky to navigate the crowds, even hotel contracts and coach regulations and trying to navigate all this within the centennial. That was tricky, very, very tricky. But again, I mean, we had so many new museums open up. The Ring of Remembrance, that huge important memorial, I think was so needed in the landscape, and the centenary just boosted that. So yeah, it was a double-edged sword for sure. I look back at the centenary now and I think nothing but positive, just it was very memorable, very, very memorable. Such a one. And to be in Ypres on November 11th, 2018, with just the world around you and all these different nationalities coming together that had the same story. Wow. That was phenomenal. I think, Ypres probably must have had a hard time navigating with those huge crowds, but that was by far one of my favorite moments in my life to be there for that.
Yeah, and I know some people were critical about big events like that, but for me, my feeling is history belongs to us all. So we can't but expect lots of people want to be there.
Absolutely. And it should be encouraged. I think it should be encouraged. There's so many different types of tourism that I frown upon. But if there's anything that I would wish to be, any type of tourism that I wish people did at least once in their life, it would be this specific subject. It doesn't have to be focused on the First World War, but just our collective battlefield history is so important.
And during that centenary period in Canada, do you think it pushed the First World War and Canada's involvement in it up the page a bit?
I hope so. I still think we struggle. I would love to know if it's the same for you, but we kind of struggle with the Second World War being kind of a blinder in front. So I still think, despite the Canadians losing more of our military in the First World War, I still think the focus is very much on the second. And sometimes I struggle with, especially when it's customized programs where, the family has a specific wish list of what they want to do in a certain number of days. And, I think it's important that they see the First World War, but they might just really want to see the Normandy beaches or just focus on the Second World War story. So I still find that for us, there is a kind of a struggle to bring them back to the First World War story because they're so integral to each other. I firmly believe that you can't understand what happened in the second if you don't explore the first,
And do you think it's interesting you say that, because when I lived at Courcelette, we didn't get quite so many Canadian servicemen then coming from Germany as they probably did during the height of the Cold War, when there was a lot of Canadians in West Germany. But a lot of them said there was a bit of a disconnect with the First World War because so many of the original Canadians had been born in Britain, and when they've been killed, their connection with Canada, direct connection, had been lost. They died in Canadian uniform, but they had no family in Canada, no wife, no children. So modern Canadians, like you say, like when they look back, they look more at World War II.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You're right. That's a direct Canadians coming over from Britain for that specific generation. Yeah, perhaps that's a reason as to why we haven't looked at it with as much reverence as we have the Second World War, for sure. And I still think there's a narrative there in Canada, our relations to Britain and how kind of our perspective has changed on that too. So that's interesting for sure. Yeah. But when it comes to Courcelette, I think that a lot of Canadian tours can drive by that site very quickly without stopping. And really, I think that's not just a Canadian story. You can't fully understand the Battle of the Somme 1916 without understanding Courcelette and what happened there. So I think, it's interesting that not only are Canadians kind of focused more on the Second World War story, but Courcelette tends to be a drive-by.
Yeah, and I think if it was a British story, it probably would be the same, because the slight confusion, of course, is Newfoundland becoming part of Canada after the Second World War, and the Newfoundland Park at Beaumont Hamel, which, no idea how many people visit that location, particularly during the centenary. It's going to be huge numbers.
Mhm.
If it was a toss up between some open fields around Courcelette and a whole park full of trenches and shell holes, people are logically going to go there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, and that's kind of it's tricky for us, and I think any guides who are working with Canadians, is that it's so important to separate the two, to separate Beaumont Hamel from Courcelette, because we were different. The Newfoundlanders were their own country, and the Newfoundlanders still have a great deal of pride. I mean, July 1st is Canada Day in Canada, but for the Newfoundlanders, it's still Memorial Day because of what happened at the Somme. So there's a sensitivity there when it comes to handling the Newfoundland story and handling Beaumont Hamel versus Courcelette. It's a different narrative, and that's very important between Canada and Newfoundland.
And I guess that's important, why it's important for there to be a battlefield guide with a group to bring that story and to highlight that story and the differences between these stories, to connect it all up.
Yeah, for sure. I think without a doubt, anyone should go with a guide. They can be local, they can be, but as long as you have that narrative and that background, I don't even think text. If you read it in text, it'll give you that right source. And Beaumont Hamel is a great site because there's Canadians there already from Veteran Affairs, students that are there to kind of explain that a little bit. But I think having a guide there enhances that. And it's so needed at Courcelette, especially.
And when you bring Canadian groups over, are there particular areas that they want to visit? Now, I'm going to mention the V word now, which is Vimy, because in some respects, going back to what we've just been saying, Vimy is almost like a byword for the Great War in Canada.
Very much. It's on our $20 bill. Vimy, I think it should be a something that every Canadian can hold in their minds. Absolutely. Vimy is a site that everyone should see. I think I'm a huge fan of Walter Allward, the sculptor of Vimy. I think I've always been a huge fan of his. I've heard stories from other Canadians about him, so they're not to ever take away from Vimy. But yeah, I think for us, when Canadians say, "Oh, I just want to go to Vimy and nowhere else," and there's a lot of Canadians who will go to Paris and then ask about doing a day trip just to Vimy and nothing else. So we struggle with Vimy because it's something that should be in every Canadian's minds, absolutely. But you're so close to Beaumont Hamel, and then there's the whole argument of the Hill 70 Memorial, which finally went up into 2017 as well, and that was a privately funded project in Canada, and Vimy was publicly funded. So the differences between those two sites, how from a historical narrative, Hill 70 should be a more for Canadians, it should be more in our forefront of our minds to understand Hill 70. But you can't argue that Vimy, the memorial, is beautiful, and you can understand so much more about the landscape while standing there. So yeah, Vimy is always going to be a site that every Canadian should go to, absolutely. But I think we are still going to struggle with pulling Canadians to other places. And I still work with operators and travel agents who say that you can do Vimy in a day and then go up to Ypres. Whereas I think in my lifetime, that's changed. I think in my lifetime, you need to spend more time at Vimy because the interpretation center is bigger. And they're extending tunnels down there that we can explore next year. But also you have Hill 70. I think Notre Dame de Lorette. I think every Canadian who goes to Vimy needs to see Notre Dame de Lorette as well, because that's a part of the Battle of Arras. That's a part of that whole story. And again, the features of those two landscapes are so, so similar. Not only would you understand the First World War from just seeing those two sites, but you could also understand, just the methodology behind the static warfare, just by seeing those two sites. So we Canadians, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to educating Canadians on Vimy and the other sites in the area and how they're connected to each other. But all those little museums and all those passionate communities in those areas that you should be meeting and engaging with as well. It's not just, it shouldn't be just like, oh, I saw Vimy, here's a stamp on my card saying that I've done this in my life, check. There's so much more to see.
But I guess, as you've explained it, it's a way everyone's going to want to see Vimy, and let's work with that, and let's use it as a way to explain the bigger picture.
Exactly. Absolutely. And it would a great benefit, to say like, we've got this wonderful site that we can use as a draw to bring people in. But once you're there, there's so much more to learn and to know just from Vimy alone, for sure. Yeah. I can't help but get excited anytime I do hear Vimy come up in conversation and, on an international stage. I always I'm proud of it. Absolutely.
Well, who wouldn't be proud of such a magnificent memorial? I was going to ask you, when Canadians that you take out there, when they visit Vimy, what do they say? How do they feel?
It's the same time. It's the same reaction every time, and even me and how many people I've worked with who have been to Vimy a million times in their life. I mean, before COVID, I was there. Oh my goodness, like every month, all the time. I think you can't help yourself, but I take a picture. I can't help but I have the same picture on my phone for years and years and years. It's just it doesn't matter how many times you're there, and it doesn't matter what the weather is like either. If it's sunny or if it's rainy, it's just it's a thing that you can't not gasp at because it is so beautiful. And it's such an important story. But yeah, you got to prepare Canadians for that too, I think, because we see it on our $20 bill, and we see it in Canadian stamps, and we have this image of it, but it's not like seeing the Statue of Liberty where you're like, oh, it's much smaller than I imagined. No, Vimy is huge, So to kind of mentally prepare people that it is going to be just as incredible a site as you made up in your mind, and it can be so emotional for people. It can be a really emotional site, and I can't go there by myself. I've done it once before, and when you're there alone, it's a very overwhelming feeling. So yeah, you've got to mentally prepare people and know that, you're going to be taking a million pictures and you're going to have a million pictures of the same thing.
Yeah, well, I'm guilty of that too. I mean, wherever I go, I'm always snapping away with the iPhone, and passengers say, "You must have photographed that 1,000 times." And you think, well,
Exactly.
yeah, I have, but it's not going to harm to do it again.
Yeah, no harm. Yeah, this is it as it goes through the ages,
But I think in the modern world, sort of expressing things through taking images like that, I think there's an interesting way to view places through the lens of something, through the lens of an actual camera or your phone screen or whatever, and perhaps it gives you a slightly different definition. I mean, you can become obsessed with it, sure, but I think the way you frame something up, you're reacting to it, and I guess that's what sculptors like Allwood wanted you to do.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It's your reaction to it. Yeah. And I was actually just talking to a traveler the other day, this wonderful woman that I've worked with for years and years. And I love her pictures. And I actually have saved, I always ask her to send me pictures because she has this great talent of capturing the love or this different perspective. So it's nice to see all those different perspectives of a site because you can see that through someone's eyes, through their own perspective.
And with the centenary, we both saw lots of sites like Tyne Cart and and Passchendaele and Sanctuary Wood and all these other locations have staggering number of visitors, and that went sort of up and down a bit. But beyond
Mhm.
the centenary, certainly in Britain, we see interest continuing to grow. Is that the same in Canada?
Yeah, I don't think that interest will go away. I think, especially when we look at younger generations, we see not just an interest, but a knowledge that certainly my generation didn't have at the same age. So even, there's, I don't think that's going to go away. I know that numbers will dip and rise, and that's directly correlated to our economy. We saw that in 2008. We'll see that again in COVID. But the general interest is there, and I know that because over COVID, I've been working at a high school in my local area, and speaking with these students, and the high school that I'm working at is for teenagers that are coming to return to class. So I'm not working with students that are excelling in academics, but when I talk about what my work is, the level of interest and the level of knowledge is unbelievable. And I have students that are telling me, they're really interested in the Eastern Front. Whoa, these kids the kids who we're working with today weren't even alive during 9/11. And yet they have such a strong understanding of, and thank you to video games and thank you to media. Absolutely. But I think that there's going to be, that this interest will grow and grow. Hopefully. That I think there's a fight for that. And I think we should continue fighting for that, because I think that it's such a beneficial form of tourism.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think, with the growth in remembrance tourism, there is a connection, as we've discussed, between people that want to see relatives who were there, but there will be many people from many different communities that might not have that direct connection, but yet the First World War continues to inspire and interest them.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, yeah, look at all the amazing people involved in the communities and in the learning side. I think it's easy to motivate. And it's also just one of those things, like once you've seen it a little bit, you can't help but kind of get addicted to the learning and the knowledge, because it's so powerful to our understanding of the world we live in today, especially the First World War. My goodness.
And in Canada, you've got so many resources to help bring that sort of picture of the First World War alive, whether it's photographs, the incredible collection of images that you've got in the Canadian archives, the war diaries, or even the war art, which for Canada, there's some staggering paintings from that period.
Oh, isn't there just? Oh my goodness, absolutely. I spoke to our Canadian war artist, Roger Chabot, a couple months ago, and to see that with the military today, that trend continues. War art, I think, is really important to our understanding of the conflicts. But you go into Ottawa's parliament today, and some of the most famous, beautiful images in the judicial courts and the Supreme Court. I mean, it's everywhere. It's beautiful too, isn't it? Gorgeous
Yeah,
stuff.
and some real defining images. I mean, there's that absolutely massive one of the Canadians at the Second Battle of Ypres, where they've got their Colt machine gun and the line of guys in the trenches, and the Germans are coming at them through the gas attack. I mean, you look at that and you think, sure, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the poetry too, that came out of that period is just, oh, it's touching.
And I think with the Canadians, that it was a nation that was changing even at that time, from being a place that people just came to seek fame and fortune, but they realised it was a place that they loved, and they were prepared to go to war for it, and in many cases lay down their lives. And that rich subject matter of all those different people can only but inspire future generations, I'd hope.
I absolutely, I hope so. And you actually brought up a great point. I think I was listening to your podcast and you were talking about the Vimy Memorial, and I never thought of that before, but you were pointing out the names on our memorial all from different places, not different places in Canada, but different places in the world, Korean names, Japanese names, Indian names. And so I found that I think that's very touching, because Canada is very much a mosaic. Definitely different people and different identities and different cultures. So it's interesting to see that all come to life in a Canadian story.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it was to me, the most multinational force on the Western Front as a single sort of entity, and I guess that over a century later, that's what can help make people engage with it, because there's people from everywhere in the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important that we continue reminding people of that too. And that actually came up in 2018 for the centenary on November 11th. The huge question a lot of operators were asking here in Canada was, do we go to the small Canadian event that's happening? I think it was in Belgium, in Mons. Or do we go to the international event in Ypres? Because both ceremonies were happening at the same time. And it was so funny that so many operators decided not to go to the small Canadian ceremony, but to Ypres, because we are international, because so many of us are representing different nationalities. And I remember, one of a wonderful guy we work with, who's a student who's written several blogs, was really interested in the Gurkha, in the Gurkha element of the First World War and what the Gurkhas went through. And he was so excited to see the Gurkhas represented in Ypres. And he identifies as Canadian, but that was so important for him, was to see that the Gurkhas were there, and to see his excitement over that was just, it was wonderful. It's so profound that we can say that we're Canadian, but we also have these different nationalities that we represent too,
And now, of course, I mean, the last year, you and I would be out there all the time, but we've not been able to get there at all. And as we emerge from COVID, I suppose for us in battlefield and remembrance tourism, there's quite a lot of challenges ahead.
So many. Yeah, definitely a few. And I mean, big ones, small ones. I mean, small ones, I think the idea of like littering, and we were talking about, leaving flags and leaving poppies, water bottles, and the use of water bottles, that kind of thing. Those are definitely issues ahead, but issues that are easy for us to tackle. There are definitely bigger issues that are going to be harder to tackle, and it's going to need all of us together to fix or to work on or to look at, because the landscape has changed a lot physically and in every other way. Absolutely. And I've seen it change so much. I think we're all headed in a great direction though, because when I started working in this job, talking with different guides, I would ask, we have a online database where tour guides can put their research on to help other guides out. And I remember when I started this job, that was something that, no guides would see that as, their protected material. So I'm glad that more people are kind of opening up and willing to help each other out, because this type of tourism will become more mainstream. More people are looking at this. And I think that a lot of travelers would be disappointed if they see areas that are very overcrowded, or we're dealing with ethically sensitive issues, ethically sensitive narratives in the wrong way. There's too much technology, there's too much knowledge out there, or too much misinformation, I should say. So I think that's one of the big challenges we have up ahead is tackling misinformation. And I think a key way we can work in fighting that is learning together, sharing information, and peer review. I think peer review is absolutely necessary, and discussing this is necessary.
Absolutely, definitely, and I think working together is something that's come out of this period really. And you and I have spoken about a few things to do with challenges on the battlefields before, And I think that's a really good thing. If it's been a time in which people that work in this industry, and we've operated to a degree in isolation, if it's given us this opportunity to stop and pause and talk to each other, that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, we're all missing that social side of it. I think it's so important, that the community continues and we have these debates and we have these conversations and, letting everyone share their information, their resources. And yeah, we kind of all have to tackle this together. We're still, despite it becoming such a mainstream type of travel, type of tourism, we're still such a small, the industry, the infrastructure is still quite small. We're nowhere near the community that the cruise line industry has, or resorts in the Caribbean. So there's different policies that we can look at to just strengthen us more, but we're still so niche. We're still so small.
Yeah, and but I think that's good as well, because it means you get to know people, and so just like the guys back in 1418 when they were out the line in somewhere like Popperinga or in a village behind the lines in Albert, they'd bump into guys that they knew in the estaminets. I think it's hopefully once we're back out there, it'll be a similar thing for us.
Yeah, absolutely, and so it should be for sure, I think.
And that sharing knowledge, I think, is really important. I mean, one of the reasons that I started the podcast really was partly about that, because you become this big sort of receptacle of knowledge and information and stuff, and it swims around in your head, and you share it with people you know. But I think if you can share it with a wider audience, and a lot of people we've seen do that, over the last year or so, and I think that's a really great outcome of a terrible, hard period.
Yeah, you're right. It is. It's turning lemons into lemonade in a way that we really needed. I mean, if you told even 2013 me, when I was starting this job and I was so intimidated and I was terrified, and I had worked with veterans, but veterans, the relationship I had with Canadian veterans they weren't sitting down and telling me everything I needed to know. If I told 2013 me today that I had access to the podcast that you have, that I had, these YouTube videos that I can watch. I mean, there's just in the last year, there is so much amazing stuff. I've learned so much in this year sitting at my computer than I have on the battlefields. I think, and that was something that I was really worried of when COVID started. It wasn't the hotel contracts. It wasn't coach contracts. It was, am I going to lose touch with this community that we work so hard to be involved with? And am I going to lose the knowledge that I've gained this whole time, And I'm so happy to say that at least we haven't lost that. If anything, that's grown and grown,
Yeah, and I think if you have a true passion in this subject, it forever becomes lifelong learning. You never stop learning, and you never want to stop learning, and
never want to. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it becomes a part of your rest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. He says sitting in a house entirely full of books, so but yeah, it's I think it's one of the great things of it, and there is so much to find out on these battlefields. I mean, I haven't visited every cemetery, for example, and I almost sort of don't want to in some respects. I always want there to be one that I haven't been to, so that you can just turn up. But then again, every year that I go out there and I go I mean, I don't know how many times I've been to Tyne Cot, but you see something different every time.
Yeah. Oh, Tyne Cot's one of those sites where you could walk across a new grave every day for a lifetime. But yeah, as you said, it's a lifetime of learning. And I think for anyone who is nervous about or intimidated about learning about this subject, or is worried that it's too complex, I think that would give everyone a big sigh of relief that you can go into this subject forever. And there's always going to be something that you don't know. Every day you're going to learn something new, But I think on a cognitive level, that's so important for humans to be learning every day, especially from these huge conflicts that are so recent in our human history.
Yeah, and there are a lot of lessons to take away from these places. It's not just the history. I think there are life lessons, aren't there? When you stand, I mean, you're a lot younger than me. You stand in cemeteries like that, and you see all these young men, and in some places young women as well, who laid down their lives. You think, these people didn't have a chance to live their life, and I've got a duty to do that.
Absolutely. You can't not go home with a new perspective. And I learned that because we work with different types of groups, we don't work just with battlefields. So one of the groups that we work with a lot is Highland dancers and competitive dance groups that are coming over to Europe. And organically that did come from battlefields because these performance groups were coming over for specific ceremonies, but that grew into kind of its own thing. However, I did go on tour with a dance group in 2019, and I realized it was a woman on the tour was upset because she couldn't get a latte. And we were in the Highlands. So it was like, I'll get you to a Costa coffee as quickly as I can. But, the next, Pitlochry is probably the only place I can get you a latte. And I remember she was okay, but she started getting really upset because she couldn't get this latte. And I remember I was so out of my element dealing with that reaction, because you would never get that reaction from a traveler in the battlefields, because there's this perspective there that is so needed. You'd never have someone break down like that over a latte. So I think, these tours are so important. Battlefield tourism is so important because you're learning so much, you're gaining this perspective. I think it's so needed.
It's an experience that can change lives, really.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's changed yours. It's definitely changed mine. Absolutely. I still remember people on their very first tour at the beginning where they're like not really into it. They're here because, they're pleasing someone else in their family that wants to go, and then just loving it by the end, and joining their legion when they come back to Canada and things like that. You see it. You see people change big time.
You do, yeah, yeah. And I think for me, one of the nicest comments you can get is somebody that's come with a partner, and it doesn't have to be, a woman accompanying a guy. It can often be the other way around. And they say, "Well, I was dreading this tour. It's all
Yeah,
cemetery and death." And
yeah.
I thought, what is this going to be about? And then they come up to you at the end and say, "This has just been so fascinating. I'm going to go back and I'm going to read the books and watch the videos and so on." And I think that's great because, it's grabbed them in the same way that it grabbed us the first time we went there.
Yeah. And isn't that great? You're right. That is such a great thing to hear from someone on tour. But I can empathize truly, wholly and truly with someone who's dreading it just because it can be a dark subject to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's the part of the challenge of presenting a battlefield tour is that there's a lot of bad news in it, but equally that you can get some positives from that. You can be inspired by it, and you can take things from it and appreciate people in the past and for what they did and what they sacrificed.
hmm Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So important.
And I think that that all that leads on to us working in tourism, you from Canada and me from the UK. It's our job. We get paid for it. It's how we earn a living. And for some people, that's a bit of an anathema. They don't like the idea of somebody profiting from this. But
Yeah. Mhm.
I see it in this way, that there can be honour with profit. That what drives you is not the money, but it's spreading that knowledge and understanding of a subject.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone who does what you and I do is in it for the money. Absolutely not. And if they do, there's got to be something wrong with you. Something wrong with your soul, or I mean, there's better ways to make a buck. Absolutely. I do get frustrated when I hear those comments, and it does happen often where someone, even from my friends, what you're that idea that we're benefiting or we're banking off this awful event. And tourism in and of itself is a tricky subject, because is tourism inherently good or evil? And I don't think it's that easy. I think if you look at the big picture, tourism is not just good. I think it's needed. I think everyone needs to have that perspective. Everyone needs to step out of their box and see what the real world is like. And if anything, battlefield tourism is not just connecting you to the other side of the world, but to our bigger human history. So beyond beyond financial gains, I think this is important. This is a type of activity that's going to strengthen you socially, economically, environmentally. It's so important for a human being to experience that. It's much better than all the other ways that I could be making money in tourism. And again, I just don't think. I think, we all have to eat. So, that's just how it is. But I don't think anyone is taking advantage at all. I certainly don't see that with the type of people we work with. Absolutely not.
No. And I think it's linked in to a degree, isn't it? I suppose with responsible tourism, is that part of what we do is working with people on the ground out there. And a place like West Flanders will have been devastated by the last year, and us continuing to take groups there will help them in their own economic recovery.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so needed. I mean, look at the Talbot House and look at how expensive it is to keep the heating on there. And this house is over 100 years old, and that comes with astronomical maintenance fees just to keep the house up. So, I mean, that's just one example of a million that you and I have about these areas. And it's a legacy. It's not just the physical structure, it's the legacy that structure represents. So it's important that we're bringing a support to the economy back into those areas. Oh, so important.
Absolutely, because it's here's to the day when we return, because it won't be just us that will be happy with that. It will be all those people across Flanders and northern France and many other battlefields besides, seeing those people return, because without that tourism and the revenue from that tourism, places that are as wonderful and amazing as Talbot House can disappear, can't they?
Oh, could you imagine? I mean, if that happened, I mean, they survived the Second World War, yeah, it's scary, but we're looking at the cost of lumber here in Canada and all over the world has skyrocketed. If you look at, the blockage in the Suez Canal, there's these huge issues going on in the world that are constantly reminding us that our economy is so sensitive to change, and that any little fluctuation can make a huge difference. To think that we could lose these places in our lifetime because of economical struggles that's tough to cope with, tough to look at. But it's, that's why it's so important that we go back to these sites, that we bring people back, that we're buying, local lunches on the ground and putting money into these independent hotels and these families that have, I mean, you talk about it all the time on your podcast, these families that have been there since they came back to these ruined villages, and they literally picked up brick by brick and lived in these tiny tents, with just a hot stove to keep them warm. They struggled through so much to get where they are today. It's so important that we keep these places going. We can continue supporting that. And I think even before COVID, with the Yellow Jacket movement in France, this was already a big issue, that we bring money into these small little places and stop these huge cities from becoming larger mega cities. Boy, is that important.
Yeah, it's not all about Paris, is it? It's there's so many other places besides. And we see it on the battlefields, don't we, with small museums and really tiny concerns that promote remembrance and history, and they need support.
Yeah, and they deserve it, don't they? With the passion and the knowledge that they have. And I think there's something to be said about the little sacrifices that these local communities have made, especially in COVID, to keep this going. There's something huge to say there because they're sacrificing so much. They're spending so much money to keep these places up for us to come back to. I think talking with all the suppliers over in Flanders and in France especially, that I think that's kind of has our heart up a little bit. Our heart rate kind of speeds up, just making sure that these suppliers are still around and that they still have food on their table. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but every single individual in these local communities that plays a part to the story. It's so important to keep them afloat and cheering them on and thanking them for what they're doing for us this year.
Yeah, it feels a bit like our sort of World War II moment, if you like. We've only had a year, not 6 years of the Second World War, but there's been a impossibility of visiting these places, and they've stopped dead in their tracks. And now we return, and part of what we do is working with people, working with each other to rebuild all that. And it feels, while that's terrible and daunting and everything else, it feels positive too.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that idea of this rebuilding we're going to have to do in 2022. But I'm fairly excited for it. Whereas if you told me that this was going to happen 6 years ago, I would be overwhelmingly daunted, but it is an exciting feeling. I think maybe because we haven't seen each other in so long, and, we do miss what we had without realizing what we had when we had it,
And when you get back out there, is there anywhere you're going to go to first?
Oh my gosh. My gosh. It's so hard to have a first place because I miss it all so much. I would love to spend, a whole summer in Normandy just on my own, I can't wait to get back to the Somme. And yeah, it's so hard to have. I can't wait to get back to Ypres, my goodness. But I think the hard thing about this is that we've got to learn so much. So there's other battlefields that I want to see now, and that's just for selfish reasons only. But there's so many other places that I would love to go. Gallipoli is on the hit list next year. Finally, the Newfoundlanders have been the catalyst there, so it'll be great to finally get over there. But there's so much more in Holland that I want to explore, in Germany, in Poland, the Atlantic Wall. I would love to go up to Norway. The story is so much bigger than just the Western Front and Normandy. That's what I really learned this year.
And I think that goes back to what we were saying before. It's this lifelong learning and this desire to continue to explore and understand and find these places, and it's never ending.
Yeah. Can I ask you the same question? Do you have a...
Sure. Well, it's easy for me. I think it's walking up that lane towards Courcelette British Cemetery. It's the point on the Western Front that I've photographed the most over the years for all sorts of reasons, but it still remains this spot, this almost unique spot, sitting on a rise, the vast Sommescapes around it, and the trees full of bird song, and it just encapsulates completely what the battlefields mean to me.
I love that so much. And I love that that's your answer. Because, it's a place, again, we got to get more Canadians there, because again, it's oftentimes a drive-by and it shouldn't be. That's lovely. So that's a simple, that's such in my head, that's an image you see everywhere, but you've got it down to an exact spot. I love that.
Yeah, I certainly miss those skies on places like the Somme, that's for sure. I mean, we get some amazing skies here in Yorkshire, but the Sommescapes, as we call it, it's quite something.
I do. Sometimes you have to warn people, especially if they're driving from Dieppe into the Somme, that the landscape is going to drastically change. And when it does, it is quite breathtaking, these long rolling hills and these long plains. It's very, very different from what the coast is like.
Yeah, you stand there as a person in a landscape that's quite literally bigger than you, and I think that's sums up what the First World War was like for the guys that were there, and as we look back on it over 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's exactly the same. So wild.
So, Sam, thank you so much for talking to us this week. It's been a fascinating discussion because battlefields, they're an essential part of what this podcast is about, and they're an essential part of my life, and I know your life as well. And here's to the day we can get back there.
I can't wait for it, Paul. I'll see you over there.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.